When you picture a medieval monastery, what comes to mind? Probably an island of tranquility in a chaotic world. You imagine quiet contemplation, the soft rustle of robes, and heavenly chants echoing down stone corridors. You see men who have renounced the world to find peace, spending their days in prayer and their nights in serene slumber. And compared to the brutal life of a medieval peasant, the life of a monk must have been a piece of cake, right? Well, not exactly. That image of a placid sanctuary is mostly a modern invention. For the men who actually lived within those walls, the monastery wasn't a retreat. It was a fortress. It was an outpost on the front lines of an invisible, unending war, a war not against flesh and blood, but against what they called principalities, powers, and the rulers of the darkness of this world. To them, the monastery was the most dangerous place on earth precisely because it was a direct challenge to the dominion of Satan. And they believed, with every fiber of their being, that the enemy wasn't just outside the gates. He was already inside, walking the halls right alongside them. For us, the night is a time for rest. But for a medieval monk, it was a time of war. The silence of the cloister wasn't peaceful, it was listening. Because in the deepest shadows of these holy halls, they believed Satan himself was walking. The hours of darkness, broken only by the tolling of a bell calling them to prayer, were the hours of greatest danger. So what was it about the night that so terrified these men of God? The answer isn't just simple superstition. It's written in their own words, in the texts they so painstakingly copied, and in the rules that governed their every moment. They believed the demons were real, and the monastery was the front line. Today, we're talking about the devil, demons, and all the dark forces that haunted the medieval mind, and how for a monk, these weren't abstract ideas, but very real enemies to be confronted night after terrifying night. To get a handle on the fear that soaked the walls of a medieval monastery, we have to completely change our idea of what a monastery was. This was no retirement home for the pious. It was a barracks, a training ground for an elite spiritual army. These men saw themselves as spiritual warriors who by their prayers and lifestyle keep demonic forces at bay. Their entire life was built around the idea of constant, active spiritual warfare. And you see this idea most clearly in the foundational text of Western monasticism, the Rule of Saint Benedict. Written back in the 6th century, the Rule of Saint Benedict was the blueprint for thousands of monasteries across Europe. And from its very first lines, it reads like a military manual. Benedict doesn't address the future monk as a student or a seeker. He calls him a soldier signing up for service. He writes of taking up the strong and bright weapons of obedience to do battle for the true King, Christ the Lord. This wasn't just a flowery metaphor. To them, it was a literal job description. Life was a battle, the soul was the prize, and the monastery was the fortified camp they fought from. The rule is obsessed with discipline, order, and vigilance, because Benedict believed the enemy was equally obsessed with spreading chaos, disorder, and laziness. He warns that the devil is constantly prowling, looking for a chance to lure monks away from their vows. One of the most telling rules deals with what happens if a monk leaves. If he wants to return, he's taken back, but put in the lowest rank as a test of humility. But if a monk leaves at the persuasion of the devil, his habit, the uniform of his service, is taken from him. He is stripped of the monastery's property and thrown out. This was a powerful statement. In their eyes, the monk hadn't just left. He had deserted his post and gone over to the enemy. This worldview didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was inherited from the very first Christian hermits, the desert fathers of Egypt and Syria. These early monks deliberately went to the most hostile places on earth, the barren desert, because they believed that's where demons lived. The stories of their lives were bestsellers for centuries, filled with tales of them physically wrestling with shape-shifting demons that appeared as beautiful women or terrifying beasts. When monasticism moved from the literal desert into Europe, it brought the demons with it. The monastery walls weren't just to keep the world out, they were to keep the monks in, focused on the battle inside themselves. The thinking went, if the desert is where demons live, then a monastery, this holy ground dedicated to God, was enemy territory they would be desperate to win back. This created a heavy psychological reality for every monk. A stumble on the stairs, a resentful thought about a brother, a moment of drowsiness during prayer, these weren't just personal failings. They were a potential victory for the demonic. The fight against sin was personified. It wasn't just that you felt lazy, it was the demon of Acedia, the noonday devil, whispering in your ear. It wasn't just a lustful thought, it was a succubus sent to test your vow of chastity. The stakes were impossibly high. This army of monks was tasked with praying for the souls of all Christendom. Their collective holiness was a shield for the entire world. If just one of them fell, a hole was punched in the defenses. Because of this, their entire day was designed to counter the threat. The 8 daily prayer services were a constant barrage, a spiritual bombardment to keep the enemy away. Manual labor was about more than just being productive. It kept hands and minds from being idle, the devil's favorite workshop. Silence was enforced to stop gossip and arguments, which they saw as demonic wedges driven between the brothers. Even sickness was seen through this lens. While monasteries were centers of healing, illness could be a direct demonic attack. There's a famous story about Saint Benedict himself. Tormented by a lustful memory of a woman he once knew, he didn't just pray. He threw himself naked into a patch of thorns and nettles, rolling around until he was bloody. In his mind, he was fighting fire with fire, using physical pain to drive out a temptation he believed was sent straight from hell. This was the mindset. These men weren't gullible people believing in fairy tales. They were living in a coherent worldview where the supernatural and the natural were woven together. The veil between worlds was thin, and the monastery was where that veil was thinnest of all. They were soldiers in a lifelong war, stationed in a fortress under perpetual siege. And as any soldier knows, the most dangerous time is always the long, dark hours of the night watch. Every monastery was built around a central feature, the cloister. It was a covered walkway surrounding an open-air courtyard, connecting the most important buildings: the church, the dormitory, the dining hall, and the chapter house. But the cloister was way more than a hallway. It was a deeply symbolic space, a paradise on earth, an enclosed Garden of Eden. During the day, it might have felt that way, filled with light, the scent of herbs, and the quiet sounds of monks going about their duties. But at night, this paradise became a prison of fear. The cloister transformed. To get why, you have to imagine what it was like for a monk after sunset. First, there's the darkness. We are so used to electric light that it's nearly impossible to imagine how profoundly, absolutely black a medieval night was. Their light came from sputtering, smoky tallow candles, or expensive beeswax candles used mostly for the church altar. The cloister itself would be almost entirely unlit. This created a world of deep, impenetrable shadows and shifting, ghostly shapes. Solid stone pillars would seem to melt into the black, and the open arches looked like portals into an endless void. Then, there was the silence. Monastic rules, especially St. Benedict's, ordered a great silence from the last prayer at night until the first one in the morning. No one was to speak a word. But in the dead of night, this silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, expectant. It amplified every tiny sound. The skittering of a mouse, the hoot of an owl, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of a brother turning in his sleep. Each sound would echo down the stone corridors. The drip of water could sound like footsteps. The sigh of wind could sound like a whisper. This combination of sensory deprivation and hyper-awareness was the perfect breeding ground for fear. A monk, already taught to expect a demonic encounter, was put in an environment that seemed designed to confirm his worst fears. And when he was woken up in the middle of the night, sometimes as early as 2 a.m., for the Matins prayer service, his journey was an ordeal. He had to leave the relative safety of the communal dormitory and walk alone through the cloister to get to the church. Think about that walk. He's groggy, his mind still half in the world of dreams. He steps out into the cold, silent, overwhelmingly dark cloister. The air is frigid, the stone floor icy under his shoes. He's completely alone. His path is a walk through a gallery of shadows. Every archway he passes is a potential ambush point. Every patch of deeper black could be hiding something. His own imagination, fueled by a lifetime of stories and warnings, would start to populate the darkness. This space, so orderly by day, was now a liminal zone, a place between worlds. In medieval thinking, such places were always dangerous, where the normal rules didn't apply and supernatural beings could easily appear. The symbolism was powerful. Darkness was the physical form of evil. Light was truth and the presence of God. The entire day was a journey from darkness back to light, a daily resurrection. The night prayers of Matins were the crucial turning point, the first blow against the dominion of the night. That's why the devil would fight hardest to keep a monk from his duty right then. The cloister at night was the valley of the shadow of death that the monk had to walk through. The architecture itself conspired with the theology to create a real, tangible sense of dread. They didn't just believe demons were in the cloister because a book told them so. They believed it because, in that time and place, they could almost feel it. The fear that stalked the cloisters at night wasn't of some vague, formless evil. For the medieval monk, the enemy was intimately known. He had a name, a face, a personality, and a very specific job. Monastic texts and art reveal a surprisingly detailed demonology, a whole bestiary of the damned, each one a specialist in tormenting souls. Perhaps the most famous, and weirdly relatable, of these was a demon named Titivillus. You could call him the patron demon of scribes, and his whole job was to cause chaos in the scriptorium, where monks copied manuscripts. And being a scribe was grueling work. They sat for hours in bad light, painstakingly copying texts letter by letter. It was tedious, eye-straining, and backbreaking. Mistakes were inevitable. This is where Titivillus came in. The lore says this pesky demon would flutter around the scriptorium, invisible. He would actively cause errors, jogging an elbow, distracting a mind. But worse, he was said to carry a large sack on his back. Into this sack, he collected all the mistakes the scribes made, every skipped word, every garbled phrase. Some versions say he also collected the idle chatter and mumbled prayers from church. In one 15th century text, Titivillus introduces himself, saying he has a daily quota. He must bring his master, the devil, 1,000 bags full of these mistakes, which would then be read out on Judgment Day as evidence against the careless monk. In one way, Titivillus was a joke, a coping mechanism, someone to blame for mistakes. But he was also a fantastic quality control tool. The fear of Titivillus and his sack of sins was a constant reminder to stay focused and take the job of preserving knowledge seriously. In a perfect bit of irony, for over 50 years, every edition of the Oxford English Dictionary had the wrong page number for its own entry on the first mention of Titivillus, a posthumous victory for the patron demon of scribes. But he was just one specialist. Monks believed they were targeted by a whole demonic hierarchy, each an expert in a particular human weakness. There was the demon of gluttony, tempting monks to sneak extra food or dream of feasts while fasting. There was the demon of lust, plaguing their dreams with erotic visions or appearing as a beautiful woman. And then there was one of the most feared of all, the demon of Acedia. This is often translated as sloth, but it was much more than that. It was a deep spiritual exhaustion, a despair that drained a monk of his will to go on. It was called the noonday demon. A monk suffering from Acedia would feel a profound hatred for his cell, for his brothers, for the life he'd chosen. The demon would whisper that his life was pointless, that God had abandoned him, making him restless and unable to pray. The ultimate goal of Acedia was to convince the monk to just give up and leave. It was a spiritual cancer. These beliefs were everywhere. The margins of the manuscripts they copied were filled with drolleries, bizarre illustrations of grotesque, hybrid creatures. While maybe playful, they were also a constant visual reminder of the monstrous world that existed just at the edge of the sacred text. Some books, like the infamous Codex Gigas or Devil's Bible, have a massive, full-page portrait of the devil himself, a terrifying image that made him feel very, very real. Chronicles from the time describe demons taking all sorts of forms. The monk Rodolphus Glaber wrote of a demon appearing at the foot of his bed as a small, ugly man. They were seen as monstrous beasts and shadowy figures. They were believed to enter a person through an unguarded yawn or sneeze, which is why we still say, "God bless you." They could mimic the prayer bell, trying to trick a monk into getting up at the wrong hour to disorient and discourage him. The powerful abbot Peter the Venerable tells a story of a monk who was tricked this way, only to find the church empty and realize with horror he'd been fooled by a demon. This detailed knowledge of the enemy was a double-edged sword. On one hand, by naming your struggle, you gave it a form that could be fought with prayer or the sign of the cross. But on the other hand, it populated the world, especially the night, with an endless list of specific threats. For the monk walking the dark cloister, It wasn't a fear of the unknown. It was a fear of the all-too-well-known, of Titivillus listening for a slip-up, of a demon of lust waiting in the shadows, or of the heavy, soul-crushing presence of Acedia settling over him like a blanket. These beliefs weren't just abstract ideas. They resulted in vivid, terrifying stories that were recorded in monastic chronicles and passed down as both history and a warning. Let's imagine we are Brother Wulfstan, a young monk in the 12th century. His night begins not with sleep, but with Compline, the final prayer service. As the last chant fades, the great silence falls. Wulfstan files with his brothers to the long dormitory, lined with simple straw mattresses. There are no private rooms. That's by design, to prevent the isolation where temptation can grow. He lies down fully clothed, ready to rise at a moment's notice. Sleep doesn't come easily. The abbot's story from that evening echoes in his mind, a tale of a hermit tormented for 40 years by a demon. He clutches the wooden cross around his neck and prays for a dreamless sleep. But his sleep is fitful. He dreams of home. It's a warm, pleasant dream, until a figure with a familiar face starts mocking him, telling him he's wasted his life, that he should leave this cold, stone prison. He recognizes the tactic. It's the demon of nostalgia, trying to pry him from his vows. He wakes with a start, his heart pounding. Hours later, a bell shatters the stillness. It's for matins. Maybe 2:30 in the morning. To stay in bed isn't just lazy, it's giving in to the darkness. Wulfstan swings his legs off the cot, the cold stone floor seeping into his bones. He and his brothers move in silence, their destination the church, their path through the cloister. As he steps into the cloister, the immense darkness envelopes him. The air is damp and smells of stone and cold earth. A few brothers are ahead, their dark robes just moving patches of shadow. He walks, his eyes trying to pierce the gloom. The rhythmic arches pass by like the ribs of some great, sleeping beast. He keeps his eyes forward, reciting a psalm under his breath like a shield. Suddenly, from a deep shadow, he hears a noise. A low chuckle. He stops, his blood running cold. He peers into the darkness, but sees nothing. It was the wind, he tells himself. But then he hears it again, closer this time, a whisper that seems to know his name. He quickens his pace, his heart hammering his ribs. This is the moment he has been warned about. This is exactly the kind of experience recorded by monks like Rodulphus Glaber. He told of a time when he stayed in bed while the others went to church. He heard something coming up the stairs. A demonic creature appeared, out of breath, and announced, "It is I who stay with those who remain." It was a terrifying confirmation. Skip your duty, and you keep company with the devil. Brother Wulfstan forces himself to keep moving. He remembers the story of a novice named Hermann who prayed to see the demons the older monks spoke of, and his prayer was answered. During the night service, he saw demons enter the church and distract the other monks, even climbing into the abbot's own stall. The demons weren't just in the cloister. They could get into the church itself, especially if invited by a prideful thought. Wulfstan reaches the church doors. The sound of his brothers chanting drifts out, a beacon of holy sound. He pushes the heavy door open and slips inside. The church is still dark, lit only by a few altar candles, but it is a safe harbor. He finds his place, the familiar wood of the choir stall smooth beneath his hands. He joins the chant, the ancient words both a comfort and a weapon. The battle for the night has been won, but he knows the war is far from over. The sun will rise, and the demons will retreat to the shadows. But they will be back. The darkness will fall again, and the night watch will have to be stood once more. The most terrifying encounters were often saved for the hour of death. The chronicler Guibert of Nogent tells of a dying monk who began to cry out in terror, claiming he was being tormented by oppressive demons. When his brothers urged him to pray to the Virgin Mary, he blasphemed, saying she had no power and the demons were too strong. He died that night, his soul apparently lost in the final battle. For the men hearing these stories, they were like intelligence reports from the front line, stark reminders of the reality of their enemy and the eternal price of failure. This constant state of spiritual warfare, this belief in a tangible, relentless demonic presence, shaped every single part of the monastic world. If you find this glimpse into the medieval mind as fascinating as I do, and you want to explore more of the strange and complex history of our ancestors, make sure you subscribe to the channel and click that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the past. So why was the medieval monastery, a place we think of as peaceful, so deeply haunted by this fear? It wasn't simple, ignorant superstition. It was the logical end point of a powerful and consistent worldview. They saw themselves as God's special forces, living under a military-like discipline laid out in Saint Benedict's rule. They were engaging the enemy on a spiritual plane, so they expected the fiercest resistance imaginable. Their very environment was turned against them. The architecture of the cloister, the enforced silence, and the profound darkness of night created a sensory landscape ripe for terror. The nightly walk to prayer became a psychological ordeal, a forced, solitary confrontation with the shadows. And they had a detailed understanding of their enemy. Through stories and art, they knew the names and tactics of demons like Titivillus, the collector of typos, and Acedia, the soul-crushing demon of despair. By naming their psychological struggles, they could fight them, but it also populated their world with a host of personal adversaries. These beliefs were then hammered home by powerful stories from chroniclers, which served as historical records and warnings that maintained discipline and reminded every monk what was at stake. This satanic panic inside the monastery wasn't a craze. It was a chronic state of siege that lasted for centuries. This vigilance against a demonic presence shaped their culture, their art, their literature, and the very souls of the men who lived it. It's a powerful reminder that for most of human history, the world wasn't a predictable, disenchanted place. It was teeming with unseen forces, where the most important battles were fought not on a field, but within the stone walls of a monastery and inside the fortress of the human heart. It leaves you with a question. We may not blame Titivillus for our typos anymore, but how much of our own world is still shaped by anxieties and fears of things we can't see? What are the new names we've given to our ancient demons?